Hi, everyone. Welcome to Foresight's Space Group. I'm very excited today to welcome Sam Jardine. I hope I pronounced it correctly. It's a really nice
Yes.
surname. And I'm really excited to dive into the dawn of astropolitics today with you. I think after many of the more technology-oriented presentations in this group, it's really cool to actually talk a little bit about the ecosystem in which they arise, what's possible, how we have competition, cooperation, and so forth. So thank you so much for joining. I'll share a lot more info about you in the chat, and please take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure and a privilege. And I'm quite excited to get stuck into this. So I'll just share my screen. Do let me know if there's any technical errors at all and I can correct. So hopefully everyone should be able to see that. Awesome. So to kick things off then, I'm going to quick agenda of this. It's very short presentation in terms of slides, I'm afraid. It's a bit more of me talking. But we're going to run through the context of space currently. Then we'll tackle a bit about the Earth-based geopolitics that are happening, which inform the current astropolitical situation. And then finally, we'll end on where is there space for cooperation and how can we achieve this? So hopefully, should end on a very positive note after a lot of doom and gloom. I'm joking. It'll be nice. It'll be good. Okay, so to kick things off then, I'm Sam. I'm a geopolitical consultant by trade, and I specialize in strategic competition and governments in space, the polar regions, and the seabed. So quite diverse areas, but they have overlapping governance and security issues there, which are quite a nice sort of lens to view things through. So I wear many hats as well. Some key sort of roles here is that I'm the head of research at London Politica. I'm a senior advisor for Luminant, and I'm a policy specialist at the Lunar Policy Platform and project lead at the Open Lunar Foundation. So this is my sort of credentials for where I'm coming from here, and I'm on the front lines of this as well, which is quite nice. Can also make me a bit biased, so I'm really looking forward to your questions about what's happening. So this is a talk that I've had to reiterate a couple of times just because there's so much content. And so what I've eventually settled on is a kind of 101 outline of what is astropolitics, what's happening, and what impact does it have, with sort of relevant examples and case studies. I'm very keen for Q&A, though. Please do ask me anything about this. The one thing I would say is do bear in mind, I'm not a space lawyer. I tend to do these talks and find that people assume there's someone from the policy world, so they must be a space lawyer. I am definitely not. I work with some fantastic space lawyers, but I will not be able to sort of do the nitty-gritty of like insurance policy and all that kind of exciting stuff. I'm actually here in a way, and in some of my colleagues who are space lawyers will shake their heads at me. But I'm in a way to sort of bring the macro point forward that space law is simultaneously very important for its baseline, but in terms of geopolitical competition, it's largely irrelevant at the moment. And that is, at the moment, is key there for now. International law on Earth is currently struggling. Expecting enforcement on space and agreements there, it's a bit too far at the moment. Then to kick things off then, space, it's not a vacuum in the political sense. Coming into this space, of course, as we all know, it's becoming the next sort of hot economic and competitive sphere. There's 100 lunar missions that have already been announced by 2030, with more on the cards as the years tick by. We've also seen a dramatic uptick in satellite launches from 3,256 in 2020 to only 4 years later to over 9,000. So this is a huge quantities. We're talking very rapid in terms of activity. The economic implications of all this are very significant. You've got Morgan Stanley famously forecasting that the space economy will be valued at over $1 trillion by 2040. There's some dispute over the figures there and how it's calculated, but it sets the pace of the direction we're heading. Key point then. So space is not a Wild West, despite what I know of many sort of newspaper articles and some think tank output would have you believe. Indeed, this title technically goes to the Arctic, which is currently the area that has the least amount of international governance attached to it. And indeed, those in the Arctic that do exist since Russia's invasion of Ukraine has collapsed a bit as the Arctic split into two. So space, definitely not a Wild West, is actually quite regulated in some sense. It has rules that are enshrined most prominently in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty and an attendant body of work there. The risk currently is that these sort of international rules there will simply become irrelevant due to sort of the pace of activity that's happening, and also that states are putting less of a focus on international law, they're putting less of a stock in it. So that's some risk there for the space lawyers coming up. Space and Earth, unsurprisingly, are innately linked. Fear of missing out and the economic opportunities of space have galvanized interest, particularly as sort of space activity is potentially a sort of paradigm shift for geopolitics. It could be the equivalent of, say, Portugal's Vasco da Gama linking Europe to Asia by ocean routes, which fundamentally altered Europe's economic outlook and propelled Portugal from being this kind of peripheral backwater state in Europe from the 1400s into sort of the first maritime trade empire of global consequence. So I'm refraining in this presentation from diving too deeply into the Earth-based geopolitics, but it is very important to understand what's happening here as it's directly connected to astropolitics. There's a direct proof there. What's happening in space is mirrored on Earth and vice versa. Also, an interesting point, when we talk of geopolitical spillover into space, it's a useful way of framing the problem because it highlights how increasing competition is impacting things, but it's also actually the wrong framing because it implies that space was ever treated as some kind of separate domain where spillover could happen. When actually what you have is essentially you had from the 90s onwards, you had this kind of lull in significant state interest in space, coinciding with a sort of period of American hegemony. Before then, of course, the Cold War, space was militarized. It's been militarized since its conception. Bledwin Bowen has a great book on that in Original Sin. I'd recommend reading that. But also then you've got currently now the activity is going sort of almost back to that as competition is starting up again. For those of you who see space as separate, I really do sympathize with this perspective. I'm just afraid it's not going to happen and it's too late to make space this sort of extra sphere as they attempted with the Antarctic. And arguably, as I can get into in Q&A if you want, the Antarctic treaty system is under a lot of pressure currently due to geopolitical competition. It's not a very good model to apply to a multipolar competitive world, as I'll get into. Might be the case that hopefully there is going to be some positive notes on here, but that's starting off the context of the sort of the downsides there. There currently, of course, isn't an appetite to really update the body of space law. There's been no new sort of legally binding international treaties since the late 1970s. It's competition. Previously, it was just because of lack of interest in space. Then it became because of the current competitive sort of competition that's going on, and geopolitical competition, strategic competition means that states are very wary of losing their strategic wiggle room and the room to maneuver. So there's a pause on any kind of internationally legal binding developments there. And again, as I mentioned, a space lawyer I actually met earlier, had a great conversation with him. He mentioned that sort of international law essentially is having to go through a phase where it's having to reprove itself and its utility in a sort of geopolitical and volatile context. And you've got stuff, and as I get into, where on Earth it's very hard to enforce. It's got states aren't really putting too much emphasis in it because of the enforcement issue as well. And the downside is usually in historical precedent, it takes some kind of disastrous event for then the international law kind of thing to reprove itself. And people go, actually, that was a good idea. Having binding rules and regulations with enforcement, what a great idea. And it's always after big sort of events where either there's a loss of life or a significant loss of property. And I hope we don't reach that into space, but usually precedent says that's where we're going. So then, geopolitics. What's happening on Earth? So I've alluded to this sort of geopolitical situation on Earth being not conducive at good faith attempts at creating international space governance. And why is this? And what's happening on Earth to inform this? And as it turns out, a lot. I'm going to distill this into 3 core points, but I would recommend, if you're interested in further reading on this, look at the work of London Politica, Luminant, Russi. There's also Open Luna's sort of registry project, which went a lot into the background geopolitics informing this, because there is so much there and I just can't get through it in one presentation. So I've taken the 3 key points that I feel is most relevant here. And they are an emerging multipolar world, competition over global governance, and Bloc-ification. And all of these hampering by lack of trust between actors. To go through them then, to kick off. So what is an emerging multipolar world? This is something that feeds into everything. And it's the rise, partly it's the rise of China that has tarnished the Western model of governance. Partly as well, it's alternate centers of power to fill this kind of gap. There was, to take things back a bit to the 90s, there was this fairly widespread assumption among sort of the Western political circles in the pre-2008 world that Western liberal democracy and market economies was the universal final form of government. And it was epitomized, as I'm sure you're familiar with, at the end of history by Francis Fukuyama. And it arguably underpins the kind of spate of very early 2000s pieces that I'm sure we all saw there in the media, where how China will inevitably become a liberal democracy because as it's liberalizing its economy, its growing middle class will demand greater political representation and rights. It also underpinned the philosophy we saw where there were attempts there in nation building in the Middle East to export a Western style model of democracy onto a different area. The assumption was it would just work. And that turned out not to be correct. To take this first then, multipolar world, the rise of China, economically and then politically on the world stage. China essentially presented this alternate vision. It far from trending towards a liberal democracy, it actually doubled down on empowering President Xi Jinping's authority. And then the comparative political stability and rapid economic growth of China's model that is presented over the past 2 decades, especially in the context of political polarization and quite sluggish growth in the US and Europe, has meant that the China model, as it's called, has become quite appealing to global South states as an alternative. They don't have to look at the US, Washington, or the capitals of Europe anymore and go, this is how we should chart our development. In fact, maybe we can keep stuff, keep democracy or certain liberal values. We don't have to deal with that. We can chart our own way. China's shown the way. The China model as well is one that doesn't apply the same moral kind of framework necessarily in terms of human rights there. It actually facilitates states being able to adopt a very national interest focused approach. which is appealing if you're one of these states. And just to get into this, actually, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit's 2023 Democratic Index, there's less than 8% of the world's population live in what's called a full democracy. Almost 40% of the global population live under varying degrees of authoritarian rule. Again, this China model hit the right time in terms of enabling these states. And what's more interesting as well is the China model has an impact on the West. There's Cornell researchers highlighted that since 1990, over 40 states have backslid from democracy, with this happening significantly since 2010. Over half these states that backslid were believed to be advanced industrial economies that previously were thought could not backslide. But they've shown signs of exhibiting severe backsliding. So this is actually quite a risk. And the reason for this is partly as China model provides both radical left and right in the Western context, an example of what we look to. It's also, though, as Western states have sought to respond to the competition that China's model presented and how to deal with it. Because open democracies with open information sharing, a globally connected economy is quite bad at dealing in a competitive environment. It's too open, it's too porous. So states are having to adjust and adapt. So this was all aided, of course, by the 2008 financial crash, having heavily undermined global trust in Western capitalism and markets. And also, of course, the Western failures in Afghanistan and Iraq, which damaged credibility for their models. This was not helped, of course, by, at the same time, China's alternate model provided an alternate source for developmental and financing for the global south. So no longer did you have to necessarily go to Western states who usually attacked conditionality to their sort of investments and developments, which was usually adherence to human rights. It could be looking at anti-corruption measures. It could be looking at espousing liberal values with this sort of traditional norms there. China doesn't attach the same conditionality to it. Going for Chinese investment, it has different conditions, which usually around resource access. But again, the moral kind of framework isn't there. It's not as prevalent. It's not as invasive. And this is quite appealing, again, to those sort of 40% of countries that are authoritarian regimes. So we talked all about China and the rise of China here. It brought an end, in summary, to US hegemony and expectations of a liberal-based world order. It's set a clear example, and actually a clear example of this is how states across Africa, Asia, and Latin America have not engaged with Western efforts to impose economic sanctions on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. And indeed, many have seized upon new opportunities that this situation has presented for expanding their links with Moscow and taking advantage of any sort of the economic fallout from that, for the positives for them. And this is why you've got Moscow currently deepening its ties across Africa. And again, this is something that, back early 2000s would deem impossible because Western states were so hegemonic there. They had the power to nudge states into what they wanted. There was an understanding of a liberal world order. Now you've got a fully fledged state invasion and you have states able to have the agency to position themselves where they feel best on that. So got there, and rise of China has fundamentally altered the landscape. At the same time, then, you've had, to take advantage in a multipolar context, you've got these two big sort of states, China and the US, competing on the world stage, and it's given more agency and more avenues and more wiggle room for other states who are major powers to start more aggressively pursuing their own interests by playing them off against each other or filling in the gaps there. And this includes states like India and the EU in terms of their economies. It's Russia in terms of the hard power and foreign policy sphere, given its engagement in Africa. And it's Brazil's courtesy of its place in global supply chains, where they're not full spectrum superpowers, but they're great powers in terms of they have these kind of aspects and niches that they can wield to provide themselves with global influence, and they're growing. This is only set to continue as sort of the century goes on. PwC has the top 10 largest economies by GDP in 2050, include China and India as number 1 and 2, the US as 3rd, Indonesia as 4, Brazil as 5th, Russia at 6, Mexico as 7, and then Japan, Germany, and the UK bringing up the rest. This is quite a radical change. And of course, with increasing economic power, you have increasing power on the world stage to promote your values, promote your interests more aggressively, and more wiggle room then to defend yourself against others who are trying to do the same. So again, multipolar world doesn't mean there's 5 or so superpowers of equal strength. It just means that there's the agency there for great powers, so to speak, like these, having that space. And of course, forecasting over 3 years is extremely difficult. Forecasting all the way to 2050 who'll be top dog is, incredibly possible, something that PwC recognizes. But the key fact is it's more about this economic rebalancing that's happening and facilitating this. So even if Indonesia isn't number 4, it's likely to increase and it's likely to grow to an extent where it will be in the top 10 somewhere. And this is the point that's happening in the global kind of economic sphere, where you've got this sort of orientation away from the Atlantic and towards the Pacific. Already, you've got 60% of global GDP in the Pacific, as well as 2/3 of global growth. As of 2024, you've got both Asia and Africa as the 2 fastest growing continents. And of course, while growth and GDP is easier for states who are still developing to get up speed on, it still highlights that there's this, while not overtaking, it's an evening out. And as Europe's not losing out, the US isn't losing out, but it's just the others are catching up to it, which again increases their capacity and the capability for engaging in geopolitical competition. These major centers of power that we're seeing, and just to run briefly around them, it could be, you've already got India, for instance, who's geopolitically pursuing cooperation with the US and Russia, while also both working with China in various forums such as the BRICS, while engaging in fairly violent competition across border areas. You've got the EU seeking to create a greater degree of strategic autonomy in terms of defense and a unified foreign policy, with the spectre of sort of Trump's America having quite heavily affected the continent, where it's this America first policy, so Europe's looking to adapt and have some sovereign capability there in case that happens again. Russia, likewise, is, while partnering more and more with China due to Ukraine, is also set out a path diversifying away from Beijing by trying to bring in states across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, particularly in its Arctic region, to try and counterbalance the interests of Beijing there. So you've got these states, again, unilaterally. If you look at some of the examples on foreign policy, I mean, they like to divide the world into two camps. It's far more complicated than that. There are no sort of two big sides like Allies and Axis, or whatever that is, Axis of Evil, I think George Bush used. It's not that. It's very complex. It's very nuanced, with states competing, contesting, and cooperating in various different spheres with each other in the same relationship on a topical basis. So it gets complex. And again, these major centers of power, though, that we've noted there for this sort of multipolar world, they will also allow smaller states to have greater autonomy in themselves. It's like a ripple effect, because they're able to then play off the gaps in between them and create their own kind of relationships without one state imposing their own sort of vision and direction on the rest of them, or having the power to do so. I know that might, that's a quick rundown for a very complicated situation. I hope that was good for the first one. Again, Q&A, very happy to thank you. I'm getting affirmation there, which is always lovely. But yeah, so that's the first sort of big point. This is multipolar world. Secondly, then, quickly, is the competition over global governance. And this is sparked directly by multiple centers of emerging power. It's where you're looking at, again, the rise of China and non-liberal regimes there to an equal sort of power scale. I hate using those terms, but it is that kind of thing where they're able to leverage their own advantage. They're looking at global institutions like the UN, they're looking at the WTO, and they're saying these were molded on what they perceive as being quite Western valued, liberal, democratic sort of value chains, and heavily influenced by the US. And of course, they're not happy with that. And again, it is a complex case. It's not simply an us versus them. You've got states across the global south feeling the same, that the world order currently is too Western-centric and doesn't properly account for their interests. So there's a lot going back and forth here. And it's not simply a case then of authoritarian regimes versus democracies, as people like to paint it as well. It is very complicated. And part of this, though, just to get into it, is the setting up of parallel institutions. It's a key point, as I referred to earlier. It's China setting up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is an alternative that Beijing hoped for what they saw was a US-dominated World Bank or Asian Development Bank. So it's duplicating these parallel structures. Again, that's providing the agency then for further states. If you're a state in Asia, you could go to the World Bank, you could go to the US sort of Japan-controlled Asian Development Bank, or you go to China. And again, the terms and conditions are different. It gives you more wiggle room there to get away from political pressure. And so there are some very positives. It's not all negative there. If you're a state across the global south is developing, you have more options than ever before, which is quite nice for you. Where it falls apart is a bit at the sort of, as we get into it, the sort of top level of global governance and what that means. Another instance of parallel institutions happening, and to keep it to space, which I promise will be mentioned frequently in this, given our overarching topic. 2023 saw the establishment of two overlapping open-ended working groups related to the prevention of an arms race in outer space, whose task essentially is the same, with the difference coming in the approach of norms versus legal. And this was both the UK and Russia. And they put forward these proposals at the UN, and then Russia refused the UK's offer to merge together. So actually, you've already got duplicated efforts, which get, again, a bit complicated there if not dealt with properly, because you've got two parallel ideas of global governance, how they're doing, feeding into each other, and it's how do you merge those and when do you merge those? And that's when states aren't happy at the moment to do that necessarily. The other point then about global competition over global governance, is you've got deadlock. And this is where competition is getting quite rife, that states essentially for their own strategic interests stop engaging with each other at the global level. One key example of this, and it was quite contested actually, is that China, through raw geopolitical power, had the UN reject its own report on China's treatment of the Uyghur people. And so China successfully isolated Western states on the UN Human Rights Council with the support of African, Latin American, and Asian states, many of who had previously publicly voiced support for the Uyghur plight, through both traditional pressure, but also Beijing, importantly, links the fact that what the UN had dubbed serious human rights violations was actually just a domestic sphere affair, that the UN should have no purview into this. And of course, states who are like, actually, global governance is a bit Western leaning, they agreed with that. They'd like more national interests first, less global oversight. So this is a very different context to what Western states are used to operating in. And again, it highlights another reason where Western states do not have the monopoly on global governance anymore. It is quite contested and challenged. Another example then, to get into the nitty-gritty of space. So all states, of course, have publicly stated that there needs to be a comprehensive set of sort of rules and norms and internationally binding agreements governing the conduct governing the conduct and governance of space to head off escalation, and that these should be through the UN ideally. However, competition over who gets to actually formulate those rules, coupled with increasing geopolitical spillover, has meant that legally binding agreements are, as I mentioned, impossible to really achieve at the moment. And so you need to look at the current norms for establishment. An example particularly of this is in space weaponization, and particularly anti-satellite capability. So again, all actors publicly have stated we'd love to ban anti-satellite weapons. They're destructive, especially the kinetic variety. There's huge dangers to them for infrastructure, for our economies, for our modern way of life if you get a Kessler syndrome style event. But despite the public statements agreeing it, you've actually had clashing over who's going to lead it that has stalled efforts. And so here you've had both the US and Russia and China have both put together proposals at the UN on the matter, but they're clashing over the kind of governance model that underpins it and whose national interests are best served. So Russia and China's approach can be best epitomized through their proposal for a treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. And this would create legally binding stipulations against the deployment of weapons in space, which sounds great. However, the US and its partners have consistently opposed this on grounds that such a treaty would bind their freedom of action to defend their space assets, while also it would give Russia and China a strategic advantage courtesy of the treaty ignoring ground-based weapons. And this is something that both China and Russia have heavily invested in. So again, it's trying to pursue that national interest at the state level, which is less great. And also the lack of ability, of course, to provide verification at the moment is always brought up as a calling card to stall things. And as we can get into a debate over how far that the extent of that is true or not. The US and its partners, though, at the same time, have attempted at the UN to promote a norms-based approach to space governance through non-legally binding rules and expectations to allow the sort of international community to police itself. And of course, Russia and China are having none of this. So one such measure that was put forward by the US actually was Japan and the US recently drafted a resolution at the UN Security Council on weapons of mass destruction in outer space, which simply reiterated the 1967 Outer Space Treaty's stipulation that they shouldn't be placed in outer space. So it was just re-going that again. It is a nudge, a gentle nudge sort of thing. China and Russia opposed this, and they actually put an amendment to it, which is essentially them highlighting their own more broader kind of approach, where they want to ban all weapons in space, which of course then got into mired, got vetoed down. Both sides ended up going away feeling quite... So yeah, the fallout of all this has been that essentially governance efforts have stalled in many areas, and that creating a governance framework for space activities that limits escalation is currently very difficult. And we'll get into in a bit exactly what ways there are through that, but it's tricky. So the other thing, of course, competition of global governance is you've seen the ignoring of international law. So it's, for instance, an example here to use China again. It sounds like I'm picking on China. I'm definitely not. There's a multitude of other sort of characters and aspects and actors we can go into. It's just they're all usually the most prominent ones that people would recognize. But yeah, so to go and hit China here, there's an arbitration panel under UNCLOS regarding the South China Sea in 2016. It ruled against China on all accounts. So Chinese claims there, it said totally wrong. There is no basis for them. Beijing simply ignored it and has actually escalated its hard power in the South China Sea since then, to the point now in 2020, you had the Philippines have identified 220 Chinese maritime militia vessels that are in the disputed area, and they're engaged in ramming operations, water cannoning Philippine civilian and military vessels as well. International law here is, and the governance aspect has just fallen apart. It's not being adhered to. It's not being listened to. And again, just to highlight this, it's not just Russia and China doing this. You've had Western states are equally guilty of this. A key example is the World Trade Organization. So the US under Obama, Trump, and then Biden has blocked the appellate body of the WTO from functioning by blocking the appointment of new judges. The US claims this is because of the increasing judicial activism at the WTO. They didn't like what was happening. Others, however, have claimed it's because the US has lost a few appeals and they're quite sour over it, and they want to reform the organization to better suit their needs. So again, it's not just Russia and China as revisionist states. It's all states are engaged in trying to shape global governance towards a way that better suits them. Third point then, Bloc-ification. All of the issues here previously mentioned, the emerging centers of power, the contestation of global governance, that have seen parallel institutions set up, all of it is feeding into what's tentatively emerging as political and economic blocs, fragmentation of the globalized system. This includes the more aggressive forwarding of a greater number of national interests into the global system, is seeing that global governance struggle. It failed in Ukraine, it failed with the Uyghurs, it failed with Palestine, Israel. You've got the Antarctic Treaty System as another example here. It's under increasing strain from competing visions of what it should look like. The Arctic Council has just totally collapsed in all sense and purposes, with 50% of the Arctic now under Russian control, doing its own thing. So you've got this kind of fragmentation going on. At the same time, you've got the interconnected nature of the global economy, thanks to globalization 3.0 and 4.0, means that state borders are now more porous than ever, both economically and socially. And this means that states are able to hurt one another and compete in a greater number of ways that are blurring the line between civilian and military sort of spheres. So that traditional breakdown where you have this is a military target or an operation, it's gone. And to give some examples here then, 3 examples are firstly with the rare earth supply chain. Within the wider ongoing China-US trade war, which alone has altered the trajectory and narrative of global trade, China actually has a history of leveraging its commanding position in the rare earth supply chain for political ends. China controls 85% of global refining capability and around 60% of output. In 2010, it reportedly withheld exports of rare earths to Japan for geopolitical reasons. It had a dispute over some islands. Beijing, of course, claims that it didn't do this due to the dispute. It did it to curtail pollution and preserve resources to provide it with cover. But what this restriction did actually had a huge impact on the global market. To take, and I'm going to probably butcher the pronouncement of this, but to take one rare earth element, dysprosium oxide, it costs $166 per kilogram in 2010. In 2011, after this event, it had rocketed to $994 per kilogram. So it had global consequences, this very sort of regional dispute, due to the way global interconnected supply chains are and due to China's commanding position. In 2019 and 20, Beijing has again publicly stated it was exploring restricting rare earth elements to the US, particularly around its F-35 program, to see what would happen. Hasn't implemented them yet, but has put them on the table as a threat. The solution for the West and others has been for states to de-risk. This is where states seek to essentially establish alternate rare earth supply sources and refining areas that are not subject to Beijing's influence. And this is the context where the US got very interested in Greenland a few years ago, where Trump offered to buy us out, essentially. It's also why that Beijing recently has curtailed its export of rare earth technology to facilitate the manufacturing process to try and slow this down. A similar story then here has been played out, of course, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine for energy security. For the EU, Russia unilaterally halted the supply of liquid natural gas, and it's led to a 15-fold increase in energy costs for the EU. The EU has reduced its energy reliance since then from 45% to 15% due to quite a rapid and costly diversification of supply chain and increased focus on domestic power production. Because they needed that wiggle room there, they will realize, again, interconnected economy that's in a competitive state, it's very easy for states to really harm one another. Then there's also the case of resource nationalism. And this isn't at the top level. Resource nationalism is not big states like Russia, China, US. It's actually small-scale powers, and it highlights their increased agency here. So it's a growing trend of global South nations who are key producers of many essential raw materials. Their increased agency is being used to implement protectionist trade policies to limit export and encourage local refining and production sort of supply chains within their state. So it's making things highly localized. It encourages global resilience for them. It encourages resilience for them from global shocks. It also serves to attract investment as you're forcing companies to go into one position, taking global supply chains, making it local. It's creating new jobs for them. So again, very good from some perspectives. It also is a leverage for us getting more favorable trade deals. And this is countries like Indonesia, Zimbabwe, Malaysia, Nigeria, Peru, and Chile are pursuing this for different goods. Particularly, usually it's in the critical mineral sector. And again, while hugely beneficial for them, what it is doing is fragmenting global supply chains into these smaller localized blocks, which, again, you're starting to see align on political levels. And this is where larger states, due to these aforementioned things I've mentioned, where they're looking at the supply chains and saying, okay, how do we securitize these? They're actually going into friendshoring. And this is essentially whether it's the US approaching, say, Zimbabwe for critical minerals and saying, okay, we'll set up an agreement between me and you in our block, and we'll also protect you from the influence of other states if you don't want it to. Beijing putting pressure on you will help you match that. And usually friendshoring, it's with political partners as well. It's with people you want to develop long-term relationships. And the idea is you still have a kind of global supply chain, but it's very localized and fragmented, and it's creating a block. And this is happening all over the place. China's doing it, the US is doing it, right down to even small states who are de-risking, like the UK. The whole United Kingdom's current concept of securonomics is this idea of finding partners to the UK is heavily reliant on international trade. But it's like, who do we trade with is going to matter because security is now more paramount. So it's trying to shift away from China and towards, there's been a shift to Vietnam, to India as well, is one of the hopefuls there. And it's people who you can have a more trusted relationship with and who, in the short term at least, will not your values and your sort of competitive aspects are in alignment and not opposed. Whether globalization will adapt to a more fragmented landscape, or as some experts have suggested, you'll see a period of deglobalization in some areas, remains to be seen. I'm not going to comment on that. It's a very murky swamp of debate going on there. But the trajectory suggests at the moment that you'll see significant decoupling from the US and China, and that this will ripple through the global economy, creating a series of these localized supply chains. And this all three things here I've mentioned is leading to and hampered by this lack of trust, a dire lack of trust, in fact, between actors. And to give an example that I always find quite amusing is you've got this example in the Arctic of Iceland, and it's a Chinese businessman with links to Beijing went to Iceland and wanted to build a golf resort. And it so happened that this golf resort was actually in an area that covered 0.3% of Iceland's landmass. So it was quite a significant area for them. And it was a bit odd because the actual landscape was an area where golf couldn't be played because it was very snowy, it was very rugged. Also, it was infrastructure links weren't there. The businessman said he'd also build an airport. He just said, oh, as an aside, I'll build an airport to create the infrastructure to get here. That seems quite reasonable. Of course, though, due to the lack of trust, Iceland and some officials in Iceland, especially the US as well, were looking at this going, oh, this is actually just a dual-use airport. No one's going to play golf here. This is ridiculous. This is clearly a Beijing-led dual-use kind of infrastructure development happening. And so they did all in their power to cancel it. And Iceland actually threw it out. Under laws, essentially, Iceland was saying there's no precedent for a foreign national buying this amount of land and doing this with it, so we don't want it. And of course, the businessman was very upset because I was genuinely just trying to start a business. And you don't know quite what's true, honestly. It could be because it's weird enough, a golf resort there, it's not really going to have the military potential there to do anything significant. It's any airport there is tiny, it's odd. But again, in the current environment, it's very difficult to unpack this. And another quick example that's less funny, I would say, is in the Antarctic, you have China's Antarctic base at Kunlun Station. They are looking to set up a specially managed area, which is briefly, it's basically an area of the Antarctic where, of course, you can't make claims, but it will give you authority to regulate who accesses that and who doesn't. And China have got, usually they're set up where a bunch of states are operating in the kind of similar vicinity to make sure no one's interfering with each other. China did this in an area where no one else was operating. And of course, the rest of the Antarctic Treaty States were like, why would you do that? That just looks like it's going to be, you're trying to cordon off this area for some reason, potentially as a way to, when sovereign activity and physical presence is a way to make claims as well in the sort of Antarctic context, in space context as well. But even though you're not meant to, that's why you have stations. The British Antarctic Survey is very open about the fact it's providing a sovereign presence to reinforce the UK's claims if the Antarctic Treaty ever fails. So they're looking through that lens. And China, of course, is saying, no, it's just for science. So you've got this dispute there and you're not sure who's right and wrong. So what does this matter for astropolitics then? Basically, the political landscape I've discussed here is exactly mirrored in space. And I'm going to take there's a lot I could go into. I'm going to take the example of the moon and the Bloc-ification of astropolitics at the moment with Artemis and the ILRS, because that's a key thread there. Again, happy to expand on this. But it's essentially when you're looking at the US-led Artemis Accords, which are blue on this map here, and then you've got China's-led International Lunar Research Station, which is red on the map. They're two competing space blocks. They're also falling very much on geopolitical lines when you look at the partners of each. There's some exceptions there, but largely it's states who are geopolitically in these blocks together on Earth. And I would point out, actually, to get into a bit of what the two blocks are about, I'd point out there was actually a fantastic presentation a couple of weeks ago on the Foresight Institute's page by Katrina, who did a great talk about like the differences of where the Artemis Accords and ILRS are together or not. I'd recommend giving that a view. But essentially, there is a lot of overlapping there. They're looking for the same water, same infrastructure, all these kind of similar areas, which, again, should be a surefire way of saying, oh, there's a lot of common ground here. There's a lot of collaboration. But actually, what's happened is the opposite. And what you've had then is essentially they're generating tensions because of it. And one example of this has been that Chinese state media have consistently framed the Artemis Accords as violating the Outer Space Treaty due to safety zones, which again, they're saying is a way of claiming when it shouldn't be. The US, of course, is saying it's not, it's just for operational reasons. But again, you can't escape the fact of the Antarctic precedent where physical presence does, as treaties weaken in terms of not saying to claim, it does constitute the basis for making a claim. So there's always that undercurrent. It's why states like investing in physical presence in the Antarctic, in the Arctic, in the South China Sea, etc. So you'll probably see the same in space. The other thing, though, of course, is that what's quite interesting is if anyone was at the UN Conference on Sustainable Lunar Activity recently, UN's first conference on this issue, it's very interesting watching the speeches, because whenever China got up and made a speech, they would mention the Artemis Accords and they'd keep consistently highlighting the Artemis Accords are bilateral in nature. And this is, again, a wider attempt to undermine it, saying the Accords are not actually part of the Outer Space Treaty. they are quite trying to frame it as it's an illegitimate kind of US-led power grab. This is something, again, they do in the Antarctic Treaty. They frame the Antarctic Treaty because they want to change it a bit in terms of Beijing keeps looking at it and saying, oh, it's very Western in its orientation. It was built in the sort of 60s with Western imperialist values. It's not currently fit for purpose through diplomatic channels on the sidelines. So you're seeing the same thing repeated here. And the key thing to remember is that you've got these points of view. The ILRS, we don't know what the principles are yet. It's likely they will be likely similar to the Artemis Accords. The risk here, though, is that because neither side are talking to each other, they're actually setting up working groups without actually, as far as publicly we can tell, without referring to one another. You're going to have essentially two very, not that they're going to be purposely incompatible, but you're going to have two systems created without reference to one another. And so you can get into situations where maybe there's enough, of course, with China not actually saying yes to Washington's offer of saying, oh, we'll respect the safety zones of other if they respect the safety zones of Artemis members. China hasn't really commented on that. Again, you don't really know what's going to happen. And of course, common sense would say, of course, they'll respect each other. Of course, they'll be compatible or not. But states aren't rational actors is the key point. States are informed by a varying degree of interests and competing sort of rhetoric. And usually even authoritarian regimes have to give credence to their publics. And the general publics, of course, have a multitude of community interests as well. So finding states' national interests are usually informed by their own domestic examples there, which do not lead to the best sort of decisions on the world stage usually. And just to go into it a bit, China's warfare diplomacy, if anyone wants to ask a question on that, I can go into like how that was very bad actually for foreign policy, but great for China's domestic image, which is very interesting. You've got then in this astropolitical kind of mix, you've got essentially the risk that these blocks are forming. They're not really talking to each other. You've also got this idea where you've seen a Copuous where, in other areas as well. So you've got, that's on the moon. You've also got in orbit is another big area where last Copuous, you had states across the global south highlighting their concern that orbits, particularly Uranus orbits above them, were being utilized by Western private sectors' interests and not their own, and wanting to have greater control over that. And it's a theme you'll see highlighted. And again, another emerging issue. And again, something that Beijing tapped right into. If you looked at it, it was China, Iran, and Russia were very much on board with that. And of course, it's left for the UK and West Artemis members to essentially navigate how they would do orbital equity, essentially, in an equitable manner. So that's a quick rundown of the astropolitics. Finally then, space for cooperation. This is all quite a bleak picture I know I've painted, but it shouldn't be. The first thing I would say is competition is a normal state of being for most of human history. Actually, states are more likely to compete than not. There was this sort of airment from the 1991 to 2009, if you're pushing it, where American hegemony was quite secure and the states weren't really competing to the same degree as they are now because there wasn't the wiggle room for it. But actually, historically, humans compete. And actually, when we're competing, there's arguments that it drives progress, it drives innovation, it forces us also to eventually cooperate because we get to that point where we're like, oh, it's either we start cooperating and talking to each other now, or we spiral off into a conflict. And of course, the issue then essentially for all competition efforts and all sort of cooperative efforts right now is to cap competition to make sure that it doesn't escalate. So you want to create productive competition and you want to restrain its excesses. Now, that's very difficult when you've got international law is on hold at the moment. And because that's usually the go-to way is you have a law that's international law that's enforceable or that at least raises the alarm for states who are breaking it and they get told off for it. That creates a sort of a more stable regime. That's not currently happening. So what you're left with is norms are the next best pathway, but norms are actually very difficult to create. And just quickly, what norms are is that there's essentially normalized behaviors for communities of groups. So that the community will have an understanding of what behaviors are permissible and not, and they're self-enforcing. It's left to, there's no kind of legal enforcement or stipulation, but if you step out of line, essentially peer pressure will see you right, or that it will be flagged as an issue and then the states can resolve it themselves. Very good in potential, very difficult to create. And it's something I've at Open Luna for the last 3 years, we've been looking at how do you create norms effectively? And because it's not enough to just say, my company is doing this. So maybe we're sharing information. Yay, we've created norms. PR departments do that all the time. It's totally wrong. To actually have your norm have any kind of meaning, you need to have buy-in from stakeholders. And it needs to be buy-in ideally that is at the global level. It can't just be me and my buddies in this political alliance. So it's Canada, the US, UK, the Artemis members. We've all agreed that these are now the new norms and that is forevermore and sorted. Hurrah. You've actually got to somehow talk to states who are even not in the Artemis Accords and get them to buy in. And at some point, you're going to have to talk to China and Russia and the ILRS. And so you've got norms are a very gradual process. They're very tricky. They're subject to the same level of state competition and wariness that international law is essentially. And so it takes a lot of stakeholder management, a lot of stakeholder buy-in, a lot of creating value propositions very tailored. And this is actually what Open Luna is doing with its Lunar Registry project. And as an example here, we've got this norm. We're like, norms, the best way to do it, the only way to do it actually is looking for low-hanging fruit at the moment. So it's looking for, okay, what's missing? First thing missing is trust. There's a complete absence of trust between actors on different sides of the sort of the equation. So how do we create trust? Transparency is historically the most viable way of doing this. Also, states all state they want more information sharing and transparency. So that's what we're going to focus on. And then how do we do that? We need a tool set to bring them back to, which is the registry project. And this is a registry of lunar objects and activities. Very simple. There isn't one yet. And we'll get people to buy in and volunteer information because, again, then we're not stepping on political toes. So there's a lot that goes into this process and a lot of thinking that goes behind it. And currently, we've been very positively received. Doesn't mean necessarily that in a year's time we'll have a functioning registry with norms set that people are utilizing it and updating it. It's a long process, and I'll keep everyone updated who's interested on that as we go. The other point then is that as well as norms, you need to have avenues of communication. This is something the Lunar Policy Platform is doing, where it's China and Russia, for instance, don't engage bilaterally much at the moment. They refrain from it, and there's a lot of strategic reasons on their part why they would do that and not engage with the US, who prefers bilateral relationships. So what we've got to do is try and find ways of creating, either directly or indirectly, areas of communication where they can get together and discuss in confidence in a way that's comfortable with them. So the Lunar Policy Platform does this through essentially confidential engagements with stakeholders, writing up reports of what they agree. And we're saying, like, this report we've done, here's the 10 top things that all actors have said they want. And so it's providing the baseline for construction to begin on how to get there for the states among themselves. So again, really small efforts. These are very small things. They're not in themselves. They won't radically alter the landscape, but it's norm creation is that slow slog to building blocks. And eventually norms can hopefully become the basis for law when law becomes relevant again and states are interested in it. The one thing I would say, I'll end on this 2 points there, is that norm creation for non-state actors, there is a risk that I think we need to be increasingly aware about, which is at the UN, you're seeing this focus where states are trying to push out non-state actors from having a say in space governance, both creation of norms and also just saying they're like how things should operate. And this is particularly because there's differences in understanding of where civil society is. In the West, civil society governments tend to take notice sometimes, also ignore it. But Russia, China, Turkey, other states have a very different conception of the role of civil society. And again, they're looking at the UN, where these civil society organizations are trying to create norms and saying, actually, that's not how we'd like to do it. That's very Western. It's not how we see things as operating. So I think there's going to be an adjustment over the next couple of years as civil society has to adapt to how we engage and how we engage in norm creation, engage in governance talks at the UN. And maybe it's like through closer integration with state, where you're established through the states, acts as being your medium. I'm not sure, but it's something to watch for, I'd say. But finally, so that's a lot of, I know, I hope both the downsides of this bleak kind of competitive atmosphere, but also the uplift that competition is normal. It's not something to be scared of. There are ways through it as well. It's not the end of all things. And the space is an extension of Earth, of course, but it doesn't mean that the dreamers and the utopianists, when I look at space, should stop doing that, because you need those people to set the grounding for what is possible there. And then they set the sphere of the possible, and then you can have a sort of scale where you operate on. So it's always important to dream of the Star Trek style utopian or the one world governance system. I'm always a big fan of that. Thank you for listening to my talk, and happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. The Iceland story was crazy. Good to know. We have a bunch of questions in the chat. Are you okay taking them right away? Do you need to?
Yeah, of course. Let me just.
Yeah, okay. I will ask people to unmute, so you're all good. So I think we had Micah first with a question, and then if anyone else has a question that is not in the chat, feel free to raise your hand, and then we'll just go down the list.
Epic. Okay, let me see. I'm just rolling on a question. Okay, yeah.
And Micah, do you want to unmute too?
Yep. Can you guys hear me now?
Oh, great.
Yes.
Sorry, my mic was working. I had a question originally, but I think you already answered it, so I'm going to skip over that one. I had a second one, which was, you talked about how there are laws, but the laws aren't being enforced really at the moment, these international and space laws. Does that create an opportunity for a non-state, like private organization to form and in that gap? And it would be against the laws, perhaps, of the various states. For example, what if some private entity went to Antarctica and just started building a city? It's not China, it's not US, some third party that is very clearly not affiliated. Maybe it's like a Chinese and a US businessman, or similarly in space. What if someone went into space and started building something that is not allowed, but because no one can agree on the laws, everybody's scared to enforce? Could they just slip in the gaps there and then establish enough of a foothold to then, when the laws do get enforced, they're already there, like you talked about earlier, where the presence is a key factor? Is that a thing you can imagine happening, or is there some reason that's not reasonable? Would the state suddenly be like, oh, no, okay, we can get along now. If we see a third party, we'll figure our problems out so we can stop third parties? Or is something else that I'm missing here?
No, I love that question. In theory, if you have a private entity with enough financial capital to do that, because it's vast to do that kind of stuff, yes. It could, and you would have a sort of first mover advantage in terms of you've set this tone. So you're like, I'm here now. What do you do? And that presents a political problem for states. However, the risk then would be, you're right, where either states will coalesce around it saying, actually, we all disagree with this because there's someone usurping our authority. And the current context, as I mentioned, at the UN, where you've got this kind of push against private sector and civil society actors having any kind of serious say in governance, I think will come into play there. Also, you've had this in the Antarctic, where you've got this idea where China particularly was pushing for the establishment of hotels on the Antarctic. And it hasn't done it yet. And again, that's slightly different because it's a state-endorsed action where it's trying to get its private industry to set these things up. But the rest of it's actually a big fear of the Antarctic Treaty States. If this does happen, when it happens, we have no idea how to deal with it yet. Actually, it might see the entire Antarctic Treaty System collapse, potentially, as it would unpick all the holes, needs unanimous agreement. Or it could galvanize this log rolling where it's a piece where, starting that negotiation. So first mover advantage saying, we've set the tone here. This is established. So we have to then shift our ideas of governance across. So it's actually a very interesting conundrum. I can see a lot of outcomes there, and I know it's not really a great answer for you, but yeah, I can see it being potentially possible with enough capital in there. I think, though, that the political reaction would be quite severe, and maybe you end up unifying. Maybe that's the spark that starts up governance talk seriously.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lovely. Next one up, we have Creon and then Ekaterina.
Thanks, Alison. Thanks, Samuel. My question, I have not a number, but I got to go soon. But what are some of the low-hanging fruit that you envision that you mentioned, I think, one slide back?
Yes. No, good question. So it's starting from scratch. So it's basic information sharing, it's transparency. And these are stuff that you have in space. You've got the US on record saying, you've got China at the UN saying they want information. Everyone has stated somewhere in their public things they'd love to have greater information sharing. And actually, it's not even, and this is where it gets complicated, because the level of information sharing, each state has a different understanding of that and what they want to share. So again, it's a very broad term, but the basics of it might just be like, we're planning a mission on this point. We'd like to let you all know, because you had recently, of course, that famous example where the US found out that China was looking at the same regions of the South Pole. There's a lot of crossover there, and it created a minor diplomatic incident where there was a lot of sort of back and forth tensions. And so even just saying, in the next 7 years, I want to operate here, that is a baseline that would be great if states started announcing it, but they're not yet. So it's as simple as that.
One thing it would be nice to have is, which we've been trying for decades and have gotten some, but not much progress, is information sharing on space situational awareness so that we can do better collision avoidance and that sort of thing. And that's, of course, becoming more and more of a problem with the massive proliferation of constellations in Leo. Yeah. And now one more, sorry, I'm going to ask another one and then I'm done. One of the things that Vice President Harris did that I actually admire, I'm not sure what the genesis was, but I believe some years back, the U.S. announced through the Vice President's office a unilateral moratorium on space, on anti-satellite tests. So do you think that has that prompted any buy-in from other spacefaring nations? And can that sort of thing work, just like setting an example and being a good citizen?
Oh, great question. So I think it did set a kind of norm among partners. So then you had the UK, I believe France, Canada quickly said, yes, we'll also do that because it's good practice. You had nothing from China and Russia. And also their argument, actually, I was seeing some of the Beijing's arguments against it they've made in some of the talks, is that actually the US only did that because they got all the information they need currently from satellite testing, whereas, of course, they argue China and Russia hasn't yet reached that stage, which is why they continued. They have stopped, though, for now, significantly doing anti-satellite weapons, but there's no agreement. So it's not clear if China and Russia are just stopping because the pressure that the US has created. I think it is. I think the US, by setting that kind of global precedent unilaterally, was quite a big move. But again, then you get into sort of the military sciences part of it, where actually simulations now are equally as viable for testing anti-satellite weapons. And also that China and Russia swung into a slightly different away from the kinetic satellites. So you got some arguments like muddying the waters there. I think it would have had more assurance if you had a positive enforcement from China and Russia on that, is when I could definitely say it works well. I think without that, you're left a bit up in the air, is my rubbish answer for that.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Wonderful. And Ekaterina, go for it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Samuel, for this amazing presentation. Really enjoyed it. I'm going to re-watch it again on YouTube. So my question may be a little bit more theoretical, but I would really love to know your opinion. Of course, you talked right now that we have a multipolar world and we need to balance this competition and cooperation interests. And right now we have these two big initiatives that do not really talk to each other, at least for now. And my question is, do you envision in any point into the future that we would finally have one single lunar exploration initiative, or at least these two big initiatives cooperating and collaborating in such extent that they seems to look like a one big lunar base?
That's a very good question. I think so. Yeah, I think to take that, then I would say I can see a future where you have, and this is probably going to be after the disastrous incident where they've crashed into each other's landing sites because no one's looking at each other's safety zones, and they've ruined billions of dollars of equipment or something. And I can see then that the Artemis Accords and ILRS will actually start talking and being like, okay, where is that compatible? Because a lot of it should be compatible. Like, it's after the same. I think, as you highlighted really well, it's after the same things. So they'll then start talking like, okay, how can we make this compatible? How do we do, particularly as where the space lawyers can come in, like the insurance stuff? How do we arbitrate? How do we do that? Like setting up the systems that you need for it. I think so. I can see that. I think it'll get complicated because also I do see a world where you've got Artemis and ILRS currently. I can see states that are up and coming who might be currently members of both, but also then starting to carve out their own independent paths. So you've got more actors, as I mentioned, that list of the top 10. You've got Indonesia coming forward, South Africa, Brazil, and Brazil, of course, Artemis member. India is another big one. Artemis members currently, but there might be points in time where actually we prefer this kind of way of arbitrating and doing stuff versus what Artemis has laid out. And of course, the risk for Artemis is because it's left at the national level to do the implementation of the principles, there is potentially some wiggle room there if a state wanted to be a bit of a nuisance, like they can interpret it slightly differently. And that's where I think some of the risks will come in. But no, I can absolutely see. I think we're away from having it's interesting because there is, I don't know, it has the African Space Agency that's just trying to establish itself, I think, since 2022. You had Latin American Space Agency. So you are getting these kind of coalescing of regional blocks because they're realizing space is expensive. And so I think maybe you will get to a point where actually they start through UNOSA or someone, through a UN office, they'll set up a sort of international space agency. Maybe it's a coordination like the EU Space Agency does, where it has a coordination arm. And so I can see that being a natural thing, especially as all states currently in their speeches at the UN like to say, yes, we see the UN as the body to do all this space governance work through. And they don't want to do it bilaterally. They don't want to do it necessarily as Artemis or ILRS. They'd like to have it hosted at the UN. So I can see that being something in the future, potentially. But I don't, you'd have to have that big geopolitical clash first over whether it be an accident, an event, or hopefully not, but a conflict. It would be an Earth-based conflict, but something happens over that to get there.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
for your answer.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. We definitely went through a lot. I also learned a lot about just like Earth-based geopolitics. I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you all for your great questions. And I hope it wasn't the last time. And yeah, let's try to have cooperation win out over competition on the long run. But yeah, thanks a lot. And I hope to see you all very soon. Bye, everyone.